Tonight, you are going to try something. Close your eyes and reach back as far as you can. Push past last year, past childhood, past your first day of school. Go further. Keep going. And then nothing, a wall, a void. The earliest years of your life are simply gone, erased as if they never happened at all. You were there. You were a living, breathing, thinking human being. You laughed, you cried, you reached for things, you formed preferences, and you remember none of it, not a single second. That feels wrong when you say it out loud. You have a brain capable of storing the equivalent of 2.5 petabytes of data, enough to hold 3 million hours of video. You can remember a song you haven't heard since you were 12. You can recall the exact texture of a carpet from a house you haven't visited in 20 years. But your birth, your first steps, the face of whoever held you in the first weeks of your life, gone, completely and permanently gone. This is not a glitch. This is not a failure. What is happening inside your skull during those first years and why you can never retrieve it is one of the most revealing, strange, and quietly unsettling stories in all of human science. And it starts not with forgetting, it starts with something far more fundamental. It starts with the question of what you actually were. Psychologist Robin Fivish of Emory University has spent decades studying how early autobiographical memory forms, and what she found reshapes everything you think you know about yourself. Before the age of roughly 2, she argues, you did not have a self in the way you understand that word today. You had sensations, you had needs, you had experiences, but you did not have a narrator. And without a narrator, there is no story. And without a story, there is nothing to remember. Think about what memory actually is for a moment. It is not a recording. It is not a photograph your brain takes of moments and stores in a folder. Memory is a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, your brain is actively rebuilding that event from fragments, stitching context, emotion, and language together to create something that feels like a continuous movie, but is actually more like a collage. And for that reconstruction to work, the original experience had to be encoded in a very specific way. It had to be tied to language. It had to be anchored to a sense of self. It had to be filed under the category of things that happened to you. Without those hooks, the experience drifts away, not because it was deleted, but because it was never filed in the first place. Now here is where it gets strange. The region of your brain most responsible for converting experiences into long-term memories, the hippocampus, is not finished building when you are born. It is not even close to finished. Research by developmental neuroscientist Patricia Bauer at Emory University shows that the hippocampus continues maturing well into early childhood, and the connections between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for narrative, for sense of self, for the story of who you are extraordinarily immature in the first years of life. Your brain was not yet equipped to do what memory requires. The filing cabinet existed, but it had no folders, and so the experiences of those years simply piled up and dissolved. But that is only part of the answer, and the part most people miss is far stranger than a developing hippocampus. There is a second force working against your earliest memories, and it is the very same force that built you. When you were born, your brain contained roughly 100 billion neurons, but that number is almost meaningless on its own. What matters is how they are connected. At birth, your neurons are making connections, synapses at a breathtaking rate. In the first years of life, your brain produces far more synaptic connections than it will ever need, a kind of wild, explosive overbuilding. And then, starting around age 2 or 3, a brutal process begins. Your brain starts pruning. It begins eliminating the synaptic connections it deems unnecessary, strengthening the ones it decides to keep, and sculpting the architecture that will define how you think for the rest of your life. This process is called synaptic pruning. And neuroscientist Peter Huttenlocher, whose landmark research on the subject reshaped how science understood early brain development, found that the prefrontal cortex, the seat of narrative memory and self-concept, is among the last regions to complete this pruning, which means that the very system you need to form and retain autobiographical memories is, for the first years of your life, still being demolished and rebuilt simultaneously. You are not forgetting. You are under construction. And here is the question that should stop you if you cannot remember who you were before the age of 3. In what sense were you the same person? Philosophers call this the problem of personal identity over time. The ancient Greeks had a version of it, the ship of Theseus. If you replace every plank of a ship until none of the original wood remains, is it still the same ship? Your neurons from infancy are largely still there, but the connections between them, the architecture that defined how you processed the world, have been almost entirely rebuilt. The person who experienced your earliest years and the person reading these words right now share a body, a genetics, a trajectory, but the memories that would make them feel like the same person simply do not exist. That should be unsettling. It probably is. And yet there is something even more unsettling buried inside the science. Because infant amnesia, as researchers call this phenomenon, is not uniform. It does not hit everyone the same way, and the differences between people reveal something profound about the relationship between memory, language, and culture. Here is what researchers like Chu Wang of Cornell University discovered. The age at which your earliest memories begin is not fixed. It is shaped actively and measurably by the language you grew up speaking, the culture you were raised inside, and the specific way the adults around you talk to you about your own past. In Wang's cross-cultural studies comparing American and Chinese adults, she found that American adults reported earlier first memories and more detailed early memories than their Chinese counterparts. The difference was not biological. It was conversational. American parents, on average, engaged in more elaborate autobiographical storytelling with their children, asking open-ended questions, adding emotional detail, encouraging the child to narrate their own experiences back. Chinese parenting culture, traditionally more focused on social harmony than individual narrative, did less of this. And the result was that the children's memory systems were differently scaffolded. The self-narrative architecture was built earlier in one group than the other. Your earliest memory is not just a product of your brain. It is a product of the conversations you were never told you were having. Maori adults in New Zealand, whose culture places extraordinary emphasis on personal and ancestral storytelling from the earliest ages, have some of the earliest first memories ever recorded in psychological research, on average around age 2.5, nearly a full year earlier than most Western adults. The neurology is the same. The cultural scaffolding is completely different, and the memory follows the scaffolding, which means the moment your life story begins is not biological destiny. It was partly constructed for you by the people around you before you had any say in the matter. But there is one more layer to this, one more piece that most people never consider, and it changes the meaning of everything that came before. The experiences of your infancy did not vanish without consequence. They did not simply dissolve, leaving you untouched. They shaped you in ways that run far deeper than conscious memory, and they did so precisely because they bypassed the autobiographical filing system entirely. Developmental psychologist Daniel Stern spent his career studying the earliest weeks and months of human life, and what he documented was a world of extraordinary psychological richness. Infants are not passive. They are active, evaluating, learning, social beings within weeks of birth. They form expectations. They detect patterns. They experience something like joy and something like fear and something like the shock of a violated expectation. And all of that experience, all of that rich, vivid, formative experience gets encoded not as narrative memory, but as something psychologists call implicit memory, also called procedural or emotional memory, the kind stored not in the hippocampus, but in the amygdala, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, the kind that does not surface as a conscious recollection, but as a gut feeling, a habitual response, a baseline emotional tone that you walk around with every day without knowing where it came from. The warmth or coldness of your earliest caregiving experiences is in your body right now. Not as a memory you can access, as a pattern, as a tendency, as the subtle architecture of how safe or unsafe the world feels to you when nothing in particular is happening. Psychiatrist Daniel Siegel, whose work on interpersonal neurobiology, bridge developmental science, and clinical psychology describes it this way: the implicit memories of infancy become the lens through which we perceive all subsequent experience. You do not remember learning to feel, but you are always feeling in the way you were first taught to feel. That anxiety you carry for no reason you can name. That ease or difficulty with intimacy. That reflex you have when someone raises their voice or goes silent or suddenly withdraws. None of those were decided by you. They were written into you before you had language, before you had a self that could observe itself, before you could do anything but absorb. And here is the part that is almost too much to sit with. Those implicit memories, the ones encoded before you could remember, before language, before self-concept, are among the most stable and durable memories you will ever form, because they were never subject to the narrative reconstruction that makes explicit memory so fragile and revisable. They were never retold, embellished, misremembered, or updated. They are just there, underneath, running, constant. The memories you cannot access are the ones that most define you. Researcher Mary Ainsworth demonstrated this in her landmark strange situation studies in the 1970s, observing infants separated briefly from their caregivers and watching what happened when the caregiver returned. What she documented were distinct attachment patterns: secure, anxious, avoidant, that predicted with disturbing consistency how those children would relate to other human beings decades later. Not because they remembered being in that room, not because they could recount the experience, but because the body remembered in a way that bypasses recall entirely. You are carrying the emotional weather of your earliest life inside you right now. You cannot tell me when it happened. You cannot show me the memory, but it is shaping every close relationship you have ever had or will ever have. It shaped which people feel safe to you and which feel threatening. It shaped whether you move toward conflict or away from it. It shaped the specific texture of your loneliness, if you have it, and the specific shape of your love when you find it. You did not choose any of that. It happened before choice was possible. So what do you do with that? The honest answer is that most people do nothing with it because they do not know it is there. They experience their emotional patterns as personality, as just the way they are, without ever understanding that the way they are was largely assembled in a period they cannot remember, by experiences they cannot access, in a nervous system that was still being built. This is not a reason for despair. It is actually, in an odd way, a reason for compassion for yourself and for everyone else, because the same is true of them. The person who is difficult to love was once an infant in a room you never saw, having experiences they also cannot remember, being shaped by things that also ran beneath language. Developmental psychologist John Bowlby, who built the foundational theory of human attachment across decades of work, argued that the internal working models built in infancy, the deep assumptions about whether the world is safe, whether others can be trusted, whether the self deserves care, are not fate. They are deep. They are durable, but they are not permanent. They can be revised slowly and with difficulty, but they can be revised through new relationships that contradict the old templates, through therapy that makes the implicit slowly explicit, through the patient repeated experience of something different. The story that was written into you before you could read can, with enough effort and time and the right circumstances, be rewritten, not erased, rewritten. And here is where this comes full circle. You started tonight by reaching back into your past and finding nothing. A void, an absence that felt like failure, like your brain had let you down, like the first years of your life were simply lost. But they were not lost. They were just stored differently. They were stored in the way you hold your body when you are afraid, in the speed at which you trust new people, in the feeling you get when everything is quiet and nothing is wrong, of whether the world is fundamentally safe or fundamentally threatening. You cannot remember being born. But everything you felt in those first years, every moment of warmth or coldness, every cry answered or unanswered, every time you reached out and something reached back, is still here inside you right now. It never left. The void you found when you reached back into your past is not empty. It is just speaking a language older than words. And you have been listening to it every single day of your life.